Hello, I'm Jonathan Wilson, and this is another one of those videos where I tell you about a book we've got coming out. This is something that my Polish publishers have asked me to do. So this is Names Heard Long Ago, which is coming out soon in Polish. And this book, in some ways, I think it's the truest history book that I've done, in the sense that it required the most historical research. There's a lot of going through archives, going through graveyards, going through the manifests of passenger liners, things like that, really trying to piece together the story, whereas a lot of my previous books, it's been about adding detail to stories we already knew, or finding out where perhaps little inaccuracies have crept into the story, or interpreting the story properly. Here it really was uncovering the story. So it's a story of Hungarian football from 1916 through to 1956, near enough. So 1916 is when Jimmy Hogan, who had been interned in Austria at the beginning of the First World War, that's when he is able to move to Budapest and he becomes coach of MTK. And the environment in Budapest was much more liberal towards foreigners, towards enemy aliens, than it had been in Vienna. And he has an enormous influence over the Hungarian game. And the Hungarian game, through the late teens and the 1920s, really blossoms, partly because of the rivalry between Ferencváros and MTK, which I think hits a sweet spot of rivalry. They don't really hate each other, so it's toxic, but they're constantly trying to get one over on each other, and they're constantly pushing each other to new heights. And Hogan's influence is huge. And then what you find in the 1920s is that a lot of those Hungarians who were growing up in that very fertile environment, a lot of them, because of the political and the economic chaos in Hungary at the time, a lot of them end up leaving. And so Hungarian football has this enormous influence over football in Germany, in Austria, in France, in Yugoslavia, in Poland as well. I understand, although I confess there isn't a huge amount about that in the book, but also over football in South America, Uruguay, Brazil and Argentina. So really, this is a book that I guess was sort of 12, 13 years in the making. That when I was writing Inverting the Pyramid, which came out in English in 2008, that has gone through various editions since, I found a figure in Brazil called Dori Kushner. And Kushner was recognised in Brazil as being hugely important. Brazil, up till the mid-30s, had not been a great power in South America. Certainly given the size of the country, they'd lagged behind Uruguay and Argentina. And then in 1936, Dori Kushner arrives at Flamengo. He's not hugely successful to start with. His ideas aren't really understood, and he has an assistant coach, Flavio Costa, he succeeded Flavio Costa as coach. Flavio Costa's made his assistant, and he's supposed to be doing all the translating, talking to the press, but he's annoyed he's lost his job, and so he's constantly undermining Kushner. Oh yeah, these European ideas, yeah, they don't really mean anything, they don't work in our environment. But all the time he's thinking, actually, this does make sense. So after 10 months, Kushner is sacked, and Flavio Costa takes over, and he implements Kushner's ideas. He tweaks them slightly, gives them a new name, pretends it's his own idea, and this is what leads to the development of a 4-2-4, which is what makes Brazil, from 1950 onwards, the best footballing nation in the world for 2, 3, 4 decades. So Kushner was a fascinating figure, and I first came across him because he was known in Brazil as Dori Kushner. The R and the U were the other way around. And nobody knew who he was. I remember talking to Roberto Assaf, who's this great historian of Flamengo, and him saying that he'd written to various European football associations saying, who is Dori Kushner? And they all kept writing back saying, we don't know, we've never heard of him. And then eventually there was a Hungarian friend of mine, Sandalasko, a radio journalist, and he said to me, are you sure that it's Kushner and not Kushner? Are you sure that the R and U haven't got switched? And I said, I don't know, let's check. And as soon as we did that, we find Dori Kushner, who'd played for MTK. He played, crucially, under Hogan at MTK and then succeeded him as coach. So immediately you find this great tradition that begins with Hogan and starts to spread out of Hungarians. And I knew from the way the football had developed in Argentina that there had to be an equivalent figure there, probably arriving roughly the same time. Somebody who could take the old 2-3-5 and begin to introduce the European WM, begin to make the football slightly more pragmatic, give it a defensive structure. And I thought I found him in Inverting the Pyramid in a figure called well, I called him Americo Herschel because that's what he was called in Argentina. And because it essentially replicated the Krushna story, I didn't go into it in too much detail. When I came to write my book about Argentina, Angels of Dirty Faces, I went into them in far more detail. And Angels of Dirty Faces essentially gets the story right. The updated version absolutely gets the story right as far as we can. And he, it turned out, had not been a footballer at all in Hungary. He played at an amateur level, had never been a professional. He lied about that. He'd been a salesman for his uncle's salami factory. And excuse me. And then in 1929, he'd emigrated to Brazil. He'd ended up going down to Buenos Aires. He joined up with Hakoach, the great Zionist team of Vienna, which had toured the US. Many players had stayed behind in the mid-20s. They set up a New York version of the club. After the Wall Street crash in 1929, they were short of money. So they did this tour down the east coast of the Americas. And you know, in Sao Paulo, Herschel met up with them, and he got a job with them as a masseur. And off the back of that, he lied and said he was a coach, and that got him a job at Gimnasia La Plata in Argentina. He did very, very well there, and suddenly he becomes this sort of mainstream major coach, wins the Double River in 1936. So I knew there's a bit more I could go into on Herschel, but the more I investigated him, and you know, the book opens with me finding his wife's grave, which is a hugely emotional moment. And more investigation into him, the more I realised this entire culture is incredibly fecund, incredibly important for the development of football. And I also then realised quickly that this actually isn't just a football story. It's maybe not even primarily a football story, but it's a story about Hungary, how it responded to the defeat in the First World War, to the breakup of Austro-Hungary. You then get rising fascism through the 1920s and 1930s. They join the war on Hitler's side, and then of course after the war they're taken over by the Soviet Union, become part of Stalin's orbit, and they get a communist government and they nationalise football, and that creates all its own problems. And you realise that these stories of incredible heroism, incredible tragedy. So you have people like Orpad Weiss, who's still the youngest coach ever to win Serie A. He won Serie A with both Inter and Bologna, and very few coaches have won Serie A twice with two different clubs, which he did. And he dies at Auschwitz. You have people like Istvan Todt, who was not Jewish, but he had been a great goal scorer for Ferencváros. He became a coach. And when the war began, he got a job in the Admiralty in Budapest. And while he was there, he was able to access blank ID cards, and he would steal them and he'd give them to Jewish and communist friends of his so they could escape the authorities. He ends up, I mean, that story is a genuinely incredible story, and I end up going through the archives of the OSS, the Foreign of the CIA. But he ends up working for the Americans briefly. And you have all the transcripts of the radio conversations between his group and the OSS commanders as they're trying to plot for the putative US invasion. As it turns out, the Soviets get there first, and he ends up being betrayed, and terrible things happen. And so he is a real. I think Todt is a real hero. And actually now, if you go to the Dahani Synagogue, partly because of the work I've done, partly because of the work of others. The Dahani Synagogue in Budapest, which well worth a visit, a very moving, very beautiful building, and a lot of detail and pretty grueling information about the Holocaust there, and how Jews hid there during the Second World War, and in the courtyard there's this beautiful memorial to Jews who died. Just behind that, there's a memorial to Gentiles who helped out. And all this list of columns of names, all in alphabetical order, and then at the bottom is Istvan Todt, whose name's been added later, and that's partly the work of others, but partly because of my book. And people sometimes say, what's the point of doing these books? Why do you do them? And I think resurrecting a story like that does make things worthwhile. But Todt is one story among 12, 15. Different individuals that this is told through. And of course at the end of this period you have the great success of Hungary. They win the Olympics in 1952, they get to the final of the World Cup in 1954 where they're 2-0 up against West Germany and lose, And the tendency is to regard that period in the early 50s as the golden age. And that's legitimate. Clearly it is legitimate. They went unbeaten for 3 and a bit years. They played brilliant football. They beat England 6-3 and 7-1, which gave English football the first real shock, this first real recognition that the rest of the world had caught us up. But actually, it's the end of an era. The two great wellsprings of this football culture were MTK, which was an assimilated Jewish club, and that's run down by the fascists in 1940. And you have Ferencváros, which is largely ethnically German, quite nationalist, and so when the communists take over, it's run down as well. Now, they've both come back, but that period after the end of the Second World War, really for 10-15 years, they're both really struggling. And so when you get the uprising in 56, which is where the book ends, you have a number of high-profile defections, French Pushkas, Sandor Kocsis, Zoltan Cibor, but also the entire under-21 squad. So you have 3 of your major stars, plus the entire next generation. And then the problem is that these 2 wellsprings of your culture, MTK and Ferencváros, they've been blocked off, so there's nothing new coming through. And so one of the questions that Hungary's been grappling with really since the mid-50s is, what's gone wrong? Why are we not producing talent the way we did, not just in the 50s, but in the 40s and the 30s and the 20s? And that is the reason. And really it's only now that they're beginning to clamber back, but obviously starting from a very, very low base and still nowhere near the level of the 50s. So hopefully there's lots there you can enjoy, lots of football, but also lots of I think very important, very moving stories from that period between the end of the First World War and the uprising. And I'm delighted that another of my books is coming out in Polish. It's always a source of great pride that when a book of yours is taken up in another country and it is translated, and hopefully it'll sell well. So please do look out for that, and please do buy it, and thank you very much for all the other books you've bought. So thank you very much for listening.